Okay. Ooh. Okay.
All right, so it's my pleasure. If anyone can hear me, everyone can hear
We hear
me.
you.
We're,
Yep.
we're online here. Everyone's there. Yeah. So it's my pleasure to present Dr. Paula Di Nota. I've known for almost over a decade now.
Over a decade.
Yeah. And she when she came into our group years ago, I pulled her in because she had interests in looking at the brain, but from a very interesting perspective, from the somatosensory perspective and from the female perspective, with a paper in cerebral cortex years ago from her work as undergrad student called, I don't remember the exact phrase, but it was the homunculus instead of the
That's it.
homunculus.
That's it.
And yeah, and since then, she's been continually pushing this border of how society blends with neuroscience, with working with expert dancers and doing some work with our group with people with Parkinson's. And now for her postdocs, she's been working with someone at U of T and and
Anderson with an E.
Anderson with an E, and then with the Department of Justice in British Columbia with an Anderson with an O.
Correct.
And now she's looking for faculty positions. If anyone has heard or sees Paula's talk and likes it, send it to her. I send her jobs all the time.
You
And
do
so
think
with
so.
less, yeah. So let's give Paula a hand, and she'll be around after her talk to talk about things. And she knows BBCS area very well because she did her PhD here. All right. So go ahead.
That's right. Thanks, Joe, and thank you, Rebecca, for the applause. You guys are great. And thank you, everybody, for joining me today on my talk and updating everyone on all the fantastic things I've been doing since leaving the CVR 3 years ago. It seems like a lifetime ago, but I'm really excited to share with you guys some of the neuroscientific investigations of police perception, cognition, and behavior. So as we all know, it's highlighted in the news almost every day that police and law enforcement, they repeatedly face very predictable, unpredictable, and potentially violent traumatic encounters as a result of their day-to-day duties. So having to process a lot of information very quickly and continuously updating information related to threat and risk in their surrounding environment, and weighing these potential threats with their own abilities, their confidence in performing these abilities, as well as programming some really complex, coordinated, and accurate behavioral responses. Further, officers also have to consider the legal ramifications of their choices to make sure that they're reasonable and justified, and often performing under the scrutiny of the public eye. And police, they're also humans like the rest of us. So they may be coming to work with personal stressors that manifest themselves in physical ways, and that also influence these complex cognitive processes involved in their performance. So together, all of these considerations interact and influence the neurophysiological mechanisms underlying police performance. That's the topic of my talk today. And we're going to specifically focus on use of force performance. So just to give a general outline of what I'll be sharing are some of the causes and effects of occupational stress in policing, as well as some of the neuroscientific evidence supporting that, as well as looking at how learning changes performance and markers of resilience. And I'm also going to try to show in kind of an unconventional model of how other basic science research and expertise can help lend to efficient training strategies to better train novices and reduce errors in lethal force in police. And finally, I'm going to bridge the gap between science and practice and show some of the activities that myself and some of my colleagues have been engaging to promote evidence-based practices in policing that will not only protect the safety of the public, but also the occupational health and safety of police officers. So starting with causes and effects of occupational stress. So this is often interchangeably referred to also as organizational stress that I'll introduce very briefly before focusing more on operational stress related to the day-to-day duties of police work. So some sources of organizational stress. So within the actual workplace itself, policing has shown to introduce stress for tensions between peers and leadership through the hierarchy. as well as institutional or workplace culture stigma associated with race, either between members of the public or internally within policing. As
I've
well.
performed the main EEG.
Oh, sorry, somebody's mic was there. Anyway, so also in organizational stress related to mental health stigma, which might be shown as a sign of weakness and kind of a deterrent for seeking help for mental health disorders among police is very common, as well as stress introduced by sex and gender roles. So we know that policing is inherently a very masculine work culture. So females do have very different experiences that can result in different types of stress. And finally, as with any organization, there's evaluation and paperwork that can also contribute to the stress of their job role. So I'm going to contrast that to kind of the day-to-day operational stress of policing by showing you an example of some objective heart rate data during the typical police officer's shift. So this was recorded in a police officer. Sorry, I couldn't change the colors of the lines to be red and something else, but the line on top represents heart rate, shown here on the left-hand axis, and the bottom is physical activity output. So a value of around 1, these high peaks represent like a jog or walking. So just a benchmark at 100 beats per minute, which is a pretty high rate. We could see that this police officer in the morning, they're working out. So you see very high physical output that's matched with cardiovascular output as well. Then later on in the day, when this officer is attending to 4 subsequent calls, we see relatively less physical activity, but still a sustained and maintained high cardiovascular output. And some of these calls involve things like serving a warrant. And I think one actually involved engaging a suspect with a weapon, but not actually using it or firing in that. So the 2 take-home messages from this is to show that the physical and psychological sources of stress manifest themselves in very similar ways, and that officers often don't tend to recover, much less below something very high like 100 beats per minute, much less to a resting heart rate between each calls. And that definitely will impact their readiness and their ability to approach the next call. So in understanding this physiological stress response, I'm just going to give a very brief overview that basically once the brain perceives a threat, triggers a very fast autonomic response. The fight or flight response, something that we're probably all familiar with. So that's characterized by increases in heart rate that's meant to promote survival and action. And this autonomic response involves balances of the 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic system is what drives this fight or flight response in conjunction and in balance with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest system. So that slows heart rate, promotes slower breathing and recovery from acute stress. So as we saw in the last slide, that prolonged dominance of the sympathetic branch is what can lead to fatigue and burnout, as well as negative mental and physical health outcomes with chronic and long-term exposure. So complementary to the autonomic response is the neuroendocrine response to stress. So this is a cascade of neurochemicals that travel throughout the brain and body and exert a variety of effects. And cortisol is perhaps the best known stress hormone in humans. And as with the autonomic stress response, can really hinder or promote various functions. So important from a police training and performance perspective, there's basic science research in animals and humans that shows that cortisol blocks activity in brain regions like the prefrontal cortex that are involved in executive functions like response inhibition, as well as with memory and attention. And instead, what these high cortisol peaks and physiological responses is it sort of focuses, it forces us to focus on implicit muscle memory skills and kind of reactionary automatic decision-making and cognitive processes, as opposed to more deliberate thinking patterns. So in trying to understand the connection between stress and different cognitive functions, we first started off looking at memory and trying to do a systematic review of the literature. And I've done several of these to try to get a picture of where are we at in the applied police science literature to identify what do we know, what remains to be seen. So if we found about only 20 studies in the last 10 years that look at the different stages of memory in police specifically. So starting with encoding, so that's the early learning, we find that when there's a very high level of stress, officers tend to have impaired spatial memory for their distance, the location, the path that they've traveled, and they also tend to remember more target-related information as opposed to peripheral environmental information. And as well, we also see a trade-off in the amount of detail. So if you remember a lot more detail, it actually tends to be less accurate. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. In terms of looking at the next stage of memory, so consolidation or the reinforcement of these memory traces, we do have some evidence to show that rehearsal, so in the form of reporting independent notes immediately after a stressful event, does improve long-term memory, but can also encode false memories as well. And given the chatter and significant investment also in body-worn cameras, it's really interesting that there were only 2 studies that we found that look at the impact of reviewing body-worn camera on subsequent memory, and the findings are actually really unclear. So this is definitely something interesting to look into in the future as these investments and recommendations are made to see if they're actually effective. In terms of retrieval, so that's the act of remembering itself, active recall, we know that memories for highly stressful events are remembered more than lower stress events like the day-to-day regular conversations, but that these memories do deteriorate over months and years, especially for real life events, not training simulations. And what hasn't been studied is how stress during memory retrieval, so when you're on the spot or when an officer is giving a testimony or in an inquest, how stress influences either the accuracy or the extent of information that they remember during those stressful times has yet to be investigated. So in trying to understand how threat influences other perceptual and cognitive processes in police officers, we find that acute stress, as in high stakes situations, like the type of life or death type of threat, has very widespread effects, namely in altered sensory perception. So in a scene like this, if it's very stressful, the officer might not even hear or perceive the person, playing the guitar in the background. Also influences their depth perception, so they might tend to or underestimate the relative position of people in the scene that can affect later decision making. We also know that stress influences attentional networks, focuses in on the target, as we showed in the memory results. So we have real tunnel vision, as well as disruptions in gaze and blinking function, and together with sensory perception, understanding what's going on in the scene, and being able to predict what might happen next. Those 3 components are skills related to situational awareness. And I'm going to share some other research a little bit later on to show that this is really a critical skill in policing that influences their decision-making more than anything else, really. So related to decision-making, once again, stress kind of focuses you in on the target and perhaps not the overall goal, which is to resolve every situation as safely as possible. So perhaps attending medically to someone else in the scene. And finally, acute stress also impacts distributed motor networks throughout the brain, and shows reliably decreases in lethal force decision making, so whether they shoot their gun or not, but also skilled motor performance like arrest skills and gross whole body movements. But the good news is that with training, a lot of these negative perceptual and cognitive deficits can be ameliorated, can be improved. So if we understand stress on a continuum, we do see that these negative effects are referring more to these extremely high levels of stress. So in highly militarized training paradigms, where they often create these no-win situations where the person's kind of bombarded, that's where we see this impaired cognitive performance without adequate training. But we do know also that stress can be adaptive at more moderate levels, and at low levels, this is conducive to training declarative skills like laws and rules and regulations, but that at moderate levels of stress, where we are able to simulate a level of physiological arousal that's similar to what the officers will experience in the real world, that these create a very ideal training environment to encode skills that are going to be robust to the interfering effects of stress at these very high levels. So it's also very important to notice that, that there's no hard and fast threshold between a good amount of stress and too much stress, as the stress response is really individual. So for, giving a CVR talk for me might be out here, someone else, they might be playing it cool. But especially in policing, where there's, once again, the organizational tendency to downplay stress and to downplay the stigma of feeling stressed or feeling stressed out, it's really important to measure objective indicators of stress. And so we've done that with our lab. We've collected international samples of frontline police officers, as well as tactical, so special response unit officers that respond to more urgent calls, to try to understand if the level of threat faced as a function of your occupation also influences the extent to which your body elicits a stress response. So we had officers spit into little tubes to derive salivary cortisol levels, and we compared these to data from an international sample of the general population. So these are from a meta-analysis that showed the cortisol awakening response. So this is a very typical fluctuation in your daily cortisol, about 30 minutes post-waking. We see a peak in cortisol, so it's meant to kind of mobilize you and get you alert, to get you started for your day, and then it gradually wears off in sync with other circadian rhythms and hormones. So in comparing that once again to frontline and tactical officers, we see that both have very high levels of cortisol in this response relative to the general population. And as we had predicted, that the tactical officers here, that's actually a Finnish sample, they're higher than even the frontline police officers. So what we wanted to do also is then compare these objective measures of stress with officers' own subjective ratings of their stress using a standard questionnaire. And interestingly, we found the opposite effect, that the frontline officers actually tended to report, self-reported, and had higher subjective stress scores, and specifically for issues related to the public image of police, which might also be a cultural confound, as Canadian North American police have kind of a different environment than in Europe. Frontline also reported higher stress as a result of overtime and a lack of social support, whereas the tactical officers related their stress more to the risk of work-related injuries, exposure to traumatic events, and working alone at night. But some of the commonalities between both groups is that they generally reported a lot of stress as a result of fatigue and paperwork and not having enough time to spend with their family. So together, all of these different sources of stress can often manifest themselves in the form of occupational stress injuries, or OSIs, often also referred to as psychological injuries or post-traumatic stress injuries, but I'll refer to them as OSIs. And so these refer to increased symptoms of mental health disorders like PTSD, anxiety, and depression, but also other symptoms like fatigue and burnout that lead to other health risks. So I'm going to shout out these fantastic people, the Andersens and Andersons, so my postdoctoral supervisors at the U of T and at the Justice Institute of British Columbia, which is a post-secondary institution in BC that trains police, paramedics, and fire. And they are part of the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, so CIPSRT, these guys love acronyms. Together with other clinicians and researchers and academics across Canada, that together form this consortium that was developed by CIHR, and they focus on public safety. So not only police, but again, other first responder groups, to understand how we can use research to improve their training as well as treating their OSIs. So what they did was conduct an enormous survey of PSP across Canada. I think they had initially reached out to over 8,000 public safety. So that includes the tri-services as well as 911 operators. And they had over 5,000 respondents and fill out a bunch of mental health questionnaires and other questions related to occupational stress, and found that over 44% of them screened positive for at least one OSI. And they often have concurrent diagnoses. And I was able to focus in on just the police in this sample of data and look at the relationship between the mental health symptoms and their reported suicidal ideation, planning, and attempts among Canadian police. And what we found that was among federal police, so these are RCMP officers, they reported the highest rates of suicidal ideation, as well as the highest rates of PTSD and other OSI symptoms. And perhaps one of the more surprising findings was that civilian police workers, so these are non-sworn individuals that do work alongside police, they actually showed higher rates of suicide attempts, as well as higher rates of anxiety. So this kind of underscores that the broader impact of occupational stress on some non-traditional first responder employees that may feel helpless at these repeated traumatic exposures and having kind of a secondary role, as well as the need to include them in programming that helps either treat or prevent the onset of occupational stress injuries. So in understanding programming and what different types of programs there are related to traumatic exposures, they can be categorized into three main buckets. So we have prevention programs that focus on building resilience and are typically offered to trainees before they actually entered the field to try to prevent the onset of OSIs. There are also post-incident services, so things like formal debriefing and peer support that once again try to mitigate the impact of the traumatic exposure on the development of a fully diagnosable mental disorder. And once individuals do reach that stage, then we also looked at the efficacy of different therapies and focusing on things like cognitive behavioral therapy and not so much the pharmacological therapies. But the goal of all of these programs together are to mitigate the impact of these traumatic work exposures and promote psychological well-being among workers, and so in an occupational context. So together with a fantastic psychiatric resident, Anise, who helped to guide 3 systematic literature reviews. So these were funded by the Workers' Compensation Board in BC to try to make recommendations on what actually works, what programs work, where should we invest the funding in. And so we've published the first systematic review on services, but we also did some meta-analyses on the preventions and therapies that are forthcoming. And unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any clear winner. There's no one approach that's better or worse than any others, and that programs in general tend to show very small effect sizes that are short-lived with subsequent follow-up, and that within this literature itself that focuses on public safety as well as frontline healthcare workers, we see that there's a lot of inconsistency in how programs are delivered. So trying to adjust to the inner workings of an organization and dealing with shifts and administering these programs consistently is definitely problematic, as is their scientific evaluation and having follow-ups and having a sufficient sample size at follow-up. So that's kind of a big blast of some of the causes and effects of occupational stress. And I'm going to show you how one resilience training program, prevention program, utilizes a lot of the scientific evidence that I've just synthesized in order to integrate stress in an adaptive way to help promote resilience and police performance. But I'm going to take a sip of water for a moment. So if anyone has a question that they would like to ask at this point, I welcome it.
I'm also moderating the chat, so if anybody wants to enter by chat, I can relay it to Paula.
I have a question.
Okay,
but
Joe.
it looks like so when they're very stressed, has anyone decided to do like an intervention at lunchtime where they do mindfulness meditation for like 20 minutes a day and teach them as a training?
You're stealing my thunder, Joe. We're just about to get to that. So this mindfulness and meditation and breathing is definitely a component of this resilience training that I'm going to look at. But in these systematic reviews, yes, mindfulness was one of the categories of programs that again showed some sort of short-lived effects, but nothing really stellar, nothing significant and long-term. But programs that do tend to combine approaches, so something that integrates mindfulness with biofeedback, which I'm going to show you, those tend to be the most effective. So one of the effective programs was actually developed together with Judith Anderson and our fantastic police collaborators at Finland's Police University College. And I have to say that as someone who's half Finnish and Finnish on my mother's side, it seems like beyond coincidence that I've now partnered up with the Finnish police, that I never had any interactions with them. Going to Finland and being there, I never even heard of them until my postdoc, and they've been such fantastic partners. And I will introduce them by name because I can actually pronounce their names properly. So Dr. Harry Gustafsberg, Chief Inspector Juha-Matti Huhta, as well as Sergeant Samuli Mikkola, who are all former and current Special Forces commanders, and Juha-Matti and Samuli are use of force instructors currently at the Police University College. And they're also pracademics, so they're practitioners, but also academics working towards PhDs in order to kind of, once again, bridge the gap between science and practice, and are involved in IPrep. So IPrep is a performance resilience program developed together with Harry and Judith, my postdoctoral advisor. It is licensed through the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine and offered through the School of Continuing Studies, and is a course tailored specifically to the operational demands of police officers in order to build resilience and improve performance based, and it's rooted in the balance of the autonomic nervous system that I described to you before. So when we see that officer in overdrive, we have an imbalance, but an optimal balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches result in more oxygen to task relevant brain areas, clearer thinking, improved fine and gross motor skills, as well as resistance to recovery and promoting long-term health. So through sustained activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, IPrep uses specific skills and content delivered together in order to promote these positive effects. So the training itself offers psychoeducational information, so some of the neuroscience information that I presented to you before, as well as educating officers about how stress influences health and resilience and impacts their performance in the field. And working together with a clinical specialist, Dr. Joseph Arpaia, who's been working for over 20 years with people with mood and anxiety disorders. He's helped to develop some of these unique IPrep skills. So these are metacognitive type of emotional and stress regulation skills, as well as adaptive breathing techniques, similar to mindfulness, but a little bit different in order to promote this parasympathetic dominance following acute stress to promote recovery. And the unique thing as well is that these breathing skills are conditioned using objective HRV biofeedback, so that's heart rate variability. And as opposed to something like mindfulness that might be seen more like yoga or something fluffy within the context of policing culture, they really seem to have a lot of buy-in and appreciate having this objective look at their heart rate. While they might not think they're really stressed out, actually seeing it represented on a heart rate monitor on the screen, it doesn't lie, and has contributed to some of the effectiveness of IPrep. So what I'm going to show you, the first breathing skill is called recovery breathing. So this isn't relaxation breathing. We don't want to completely eliminate the stress response, but once again, maintain an optimal balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. And this basically involves a rhythmic breathing that isn't yogic breathing. It's not standardized 4 in, 4 out type of breathing, but it is highly individualized and is meant to synchronize your respiratory and heart rate rhythms. So you see here in a snippet of 1 minute, you see each dot represents kind of a second by second heart rate. And the way this breathing technique works, I'm not well trained in delivering it, but basically if you put your hand on your chest and on your stomach and you breathe in slowly, it's giving me a chance to breathe too, and you feel your hand on your stomach expanding first. So it's meant to kind of fill your lungs in from the bottom and then gradually to the top. And then exhaling a little bit slower than you are inhaling. And each individual person has their own set rhythm, so anywhere between 6 to 8 breaths per minute. And this is really important because a lot of these prescribed breathing methods, it might be too fast or too slow to someone else. So we don't want to induce hyperventilation, or we don't want to induce a state of relaxation, but once again, a state of vigilance and arousal and readiness. And so this is a technique that can be utilized not when an officer is in a call, but this is something that they can do either between calls or when they're sitting in their car, or even just standing in order to provide a rapid resting state. And using this biofeedback is a great tool to condition this pattern of breathing so that officers can do it without thinking, as with the next technique. And this is referred to either as power breathing or recovery breathing. So what we see in this slide here is an officer that's about to engage in a simulated scenario. So before they even enter a room here, we see that their heart rate starts to climb, but that they're able to utilize this power breathing technique. So it's kind of just a prolonged exhalation that stimulates the vagus nerve, stimulates the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system to forcibly bring their heart rate down and bring them to a state of readiness and alertness. So we see that they practice this a couple of times before they are actually attacked in the room. So that's how we see this sudden increase in heart rate, but that once again, the officer is able to successfully return themselves to an optimal level of arousal by using these IPrep breathing techniques. So the skills that I just shared with you are reinforced during scenario-based training. So these involve staging live scenes, often with actors and props to try to induce a real sense of realism. The image on the top here is actually at Finland's Police University College. They have a whole fake town set up with a fake bar and restaurants, and as well as streets so that they can train driving and stage a lot of different types of scenes. But it doesn't even have to be as fancy as that. We've been able to reliably show that stage scenarios induce a level of stress that is similar to what is experienced in the real world, and that's meant to increase buy-in. So through integrated knowledge translation, so from our police partners, in having them help us design the types of scenarios that are the types of calls that officers would experience, it's really important to promote this sense of buy-in, because I'm sure now in the post-COVID world, all of you professors know that when you're staring at a bunch of people that are not ready to learn and not willing to learn, it's just not going to work. So this idea of buy-in and motivation to participate actively in the training is really critical to its success. As well, the facilitators, so the officer that you see here, he's actually wearing a safety vest. He's not involved in the scene, but he's the facilitator that kind of starts and stops things. And the feedback that they provide is also really critical. So stopping things intermittently and to provide positive reinforcement is really key, as well as kind of understanding not only the successes, so when something goes wrong, yay, that's great, but also understanding why and digging deeper into the officer's situational awareness or decision-making to understand if they just made the right decision as a result of luck, or if they were actually using really clear principles, and learning also from either near misses or mistakes in order to make the most out of each learning opportunity. So the training is often delivered in groups, but once again, by being able to tease apart what was good and what went wrong, this enables the training to be delivered very efficiently, which is definitely a very important consideration given the limited time and funding that often exists for police training. So now I'm going to share some data with you to show the effectiveness of IPrep that was conducted with a large urban police service, which due to ethics obligations, I can't share which police service it is. But we had 57 police officers and recorded several objective outcomes. So these include the percent of lethal force errors for scenarios that required a shoot, because officers do have to practice this skill. So they're in the script, it's determined that they do have to respond with lethal force in some cases, as well as other no-shoot decisions. So scenarios where they're supposed to inhibit a use of force and not respond with that. So we looked at the relative errors in those two decision types, as well as objective indicators of the maximum heart rate index. So that's the relative increase from rest to maximum for each police officer, as well as the time in seconds to return from maximum back to their own individual resting heart rate. So in 57 officers, we collected some baseline assessments on these outcomes. Then they had 2 full days of skills training that was integrated with, I think, 16 different scenarios in order to condition these IPrep skills and adaptive stress responses. And they were tested on the 4th day with an active, I believe it was staged inside of a school. So they had multiple decision points, and it was it was intended to be a very stressful situation to test these newly acquired skills. And we also looked at these officers at 6, 12, and 18-month follow-up. So just to get an idea of how we extract some of these data points is looking at the continuous heart rate. We identify each officer's 5 minutes average resting heart rate in the morning. And then we have start and stop times for each scenario in order to identify the peak of their heart rate, as well as the time that it takes to recover. And we did this for multiple scenarios that they performed on each test day, and averaged those for one data point for each of our times of interest. And in some rare cases, but in about 13 out of over 400 data points, there were cases where the officer never actually returned to their own resting heart rate, but for the most part they did. So in terms of looking at the errors in lethal force, so this is combined shooting when they weren't supposed to, but also not shooting when they were actually supposed to. We see a very low error rate at baseline to begin with, but a dramatic 67% decrease post-training during their evaluations, and that we were able to see this maintenance in reduced errors in lethal force decision-making up to about between 12 and 18 months, which gives us an indication that this might be a ripe time for refresher training and skill decay over time. In terms of the autonomic arousal, we see positive values for both, which as a manipulation check, it shows that our scenarios did induce a level of stress relative to rest, and an increased post-test, which once again might be due to the nature of the highly stressful scenario that they engaged in. But we also didn't want to eliminate the stress response. So it is important, once again, that officers are able to induce a level of arousal that's appropriate to the task at hand. And again, at this 12-month sweet spot is where we start to see significant decreases relative to rest or post-training. In terms of recovering from stress at both pre and post-test, we see that it takes sometimes on average about 10 minutes for an officer to recover from that maximum peak heart rate, with a lot of variability in that, but that at 6, 12, and 18 months, a significant reduction in the time to recover. And if we remember the officer in the early slide, comparing their workout and their day-to-day, it's really, really important that we're able to promote this type of adaptive recovery so that they're able to meet the demands of the next situation. So what I've shown is through synchronizing breathing and heart rate through training, it can improve indicators of police health and performance, but what remains unknown are the neurophysiological mechanisms by which IPrep is effective at improving officer performance in various cognitive domains under stressful conditions. So there is neuroscientific research that seemingly has nothing at all to do with police officers, but can tell us how the brain changes with learning and expertise. So some of my dissertation research with Joe D'Souza has looked at dancers as a model for how our brains are able to develop motor expertise. And
Paula, before you switch topics, we have a number of questions in the chat. Do you want to quickly look at them, see if you want to address them now, or we can leave them till later as well? They're more about the police officers, so I don't know instead before you change directions.
I can't believe that I'm already at 40 minutes, so maybe we'll take them after to kind of
Sounds
get through
good.
everything.
No problem. Okay.
But definitely keep them in there. So to borrow from dancers who also have to perform highly complex coordinated movements under the scrutiny of evaluation, we can draw some parallels to police. So Rachel Barr was a fantastic professional former ballet dancer and now a Vanier scholar. She's looking at dancers to also understand how expertise is shaped. We scanned professional ballet dancers visualizing a new dance over the course of 8 months. And basically what we were able to show is a shift that as you overlearn something, as something becomes a very habitual overlearned skill, that activity shifts from these cortical motor planning areas to more insular, automatic muscle memory, basal ganglia regions of the brain. So that reflects a greater efficiency in how the brain processes visual motor information. So together with Gabby Levkov, we kind of focused in on the lateral occipitotemporal cortex, and also found similar efficiency when dancers were watching and visualizing a newly learned dance. And so these are brain regions involved in detecting motion and objects and body parts. They're definitely very salient and important information for police officers as well, to be able to perceive very effectively. So using EEG, we also compared experts to non-experts, as well as the effect of familiarity, to see if attending to a highly familiar stimulus changes activation in the brain as revealed through EEG. And indeed, we were able to find that ballet dancers showed faster alpha peak frequency when watching a ballet dance. So literally faster communication and between networks of the brain when observing something that you've learned and is familiar. And this also generalized to visualization of non-specialized movements, so walking and these types of things that show that with learning, there's a refinement of the visual motor systems that also explains how experts are able to learn things faster when alpha and other rhythms are fluctuating faster and resonating faster. In a combined paradigm, we also showed transfer effects with my friend Mike here of how improved attention transfers to improvements in memory as well when observing a familiar dance. So we had ballet dancers watch a video and press a button every time they detected a new movement. And we find in novices that they tend to see every discrete individual movement as something separate, whereas with learning among experts, they're able to consolidate some of these movements into larger chunks. So this is as a function of their learning. So we were able to replicate this established expertise effect, but also show for the first time that this is very specific to the genre of dance that someone is familiar with. So once again, how your brain consolidates visual motor information is highly tuned to your own expertise and your own training. And that further, both of these two groups that watched familiar dances, they outperformed others when remembering words related to their expertise. So in building these knowledge schemas of movements and words and language and things related to your expertise, those are able to develop through training. So now trying to apply this back and understanding how familiar actions resonate with the brain, we can try to inform some skill development and training for police to build expertise faster, safer, and more efficiently. And the key factor as well is that police have to operate under stress. So that seems to be kind of the missing key in the existing literature, and how stress influences these brain networks. So I'm currently doing this with Chief Inspector Huhta at the Police University College, and he's interested in comparing experts to novices in order to develop more effective training. So just as a trigger warning, I have to warn that I am about to show a brief clip of a staged scenario where an officer enters a room. There's a suspect that they encounter, that the situation moves very quickly and they're attacked with a knife, but they stop short of the actual attack. So I just need to warn whoever might be sensitive to kind of look away now. But kind of building on some of the paradigms of action observation that I did during my PhD, we can try to replicate it with police officers and compare the novices to the experts while they're watching these types of incidents. Ooh, I know, sorry, kind of scary. To try to identify differences in where novices see important decision points and compare those to responses of experts in order to develop the training for the novices. So Chief Inspector Huhta is doing exactly this and utilizing eye tracking to look as an objective indicator of attention. And so he showed both experts and novice police officers. So the experts are made up of special forces unit officers, as well as use of force instructors, and novices that are prior to their first field study. So real rookies looking at various static images of staged confrontational encounters in order to look at situational awareness. So again, what are you looking at? What are you attending to? How can that information be used to predict what's going to happen next? So in this paradigm, they showed officers 13 different images. So they first started off at fixation. We're shown each image for 15 seconds, followed by a qualitative interview about situational awareness. And those are going to be analyzed in a separate study. And once they were done kind of sharing their insights, they were shown some more images. And for each one, they separated the target regions of interest, so anywhere related to specific areas of interest, from the peripheral environment, and further within the targets, looking at highly salient areas in order to detect eye movements and fixation. So this is a sample of what an output actually looks like. So I'm just going to explain a little bit what you're looking at here. So each color represents a different participant, and this is experts and novices combined kind of onto one sample figure. And the two outcomes that we're really interested are looking at are within the first 5 seconds, so early eye movements, are looking at the fixation duration, so how long they looked at any one spot, which is reflected by the size of the circle. So bigger circle means longer fixation on that any one area. As well as looking at the order. So we can see, and that's indicated by the number inside of each circle. So we see the number 1 here. So this is presumably where the fixation cross was. These spots were eliminated from the analyses, but we're really interested in looking at where is the first, second, third, fourth place that either experts or novices looked. In order to identify some of the most salient cues that will inform expert decision-making and later expert situational awareness, and subsequent decision-making. So some of the preliminary findings so far show that experts tend to focus more on targets relative to the environment, and that experts also tend to focus on the hands and where the hands might be reaching and are located relative to other objects in the scene that could be potential threats. Whereas the rookies tend to focus more on the face, and that's kind of our innate response is to attend to faces. But it's interesting that through training that the experts are able to move away from this to train more adaptive situational awareness skills. So these are exactly some of the types of insights that we're trying to use to use this neuroscientific eye tracking data and turn that into pedagogical innovation to once again train expertise faster and more safely, and that results in more effective situational awareness and use of force in the field. So finally, the final theme that we're going to try to talk about today is kind of bridging the gap. And one of the most important things that we're trying to address in policing is the lack of standardization for definitions and practices surrounding the use of force. So what is use of force? What does that include? Is that decision-making? Is it de-escalation? And it's sort of all of these things together. And working with Chief Inspector Huchta and some of my postdoctoral advisors, we've tried to put together not only in the academic literature, but also publishing in police journals, not only summaries that combine neuroscientific perspectives and adult learning theory, but also provide recommendations for how to standardize police training, which is also very inconsistent across jurisdictions. So to exemplify that, I'm kind of going to pop quiz everybody. So you can unmute your mics or in the chat if someone wants to read out in the chat. I would ask you to guess how long do you think in Ontario it takes to become a police officer? So you pass the psych tests, you're admitted to the Ontario Police College. How long do you think it takes to become a sworn police officer in Ontario?
Months.
3 years.
6 months.
1 year.
6 months, 3 years. Well, boom. The answer is 13 stellar weeks. So that's about that's about one semester. And this is publicly available information. I'm not, tearing the lid off of any secrets, state secrets, but it actually takes you longer to get a beauty school aesthetics diploma to the Canadian Medical Beauty Institute. And this should shock and alarm all of you. But a bit of a better case. So to see our partners in BC, they do require 2 years of post-secondary education, as well as offering a 38-week police training program. And leading the pack are my friends in Finland that offer a 3-year Bachelor of Police Services that also requires that all officers complete a written thesis in order to develop their critical thinking skills. So again, just to highlight some of the stark inconsistency in what is trained, how long, how much, and how often. And these were also heavily criticized in a report back in 2016 by the Ontario Ombudsman that called for, revisiting police use of force and de-escalation training, which together with Judith at U of T, we responded with 2 policy reports that look at the science behind training and conducted focus groups with police in order to put forth recommendations for how we can improve some of these things. And they have been shelved, straight shelved. And even recently highlighted in the news, the Ombudsman made another statement in 2020 saying, I said this stuff 4 years ago, what's going on? And specifically slamming some of the use of force training tools. So another pop quiz, and this is the perfect audience to show this to. So in trying to understand some of the training tools and materials that they use to not only train police in the use of force, but this is also a public communication tool and should convey to all of you, which is actually a very highly educated and visually driven part of the population. But I'm going to show the Ontario use of force model, and I want you all to kind of call out or put in the chat, what does this tell you about how police make use of force decisions? What does it tell you? What do you see when you see, what does this tell you about police use of force? Well, I'm going to tell you what it says, or what we think that it says. And I was hoping for more from the CVR guys. Come on, you're vision scientists. But basically the use of color, if your eye is immediately drawn to the red, this says lethal force, it might ingrain some implicit associations that police use of force decision-making is lethal force, or inevitably ends up escalating to lethal force. So despite the, how horrific this model might be, us as visual scientists, we're not really doing any better with some of these hot mess diagrams of models of very complex and dynamic systems and decision-making into one static figure. I acknowledge that that is definitely very difficult, but that we can try to learn and bridge across industries to understand how we can develop better models. And we've done that together with Jody Jenkinson. She's the director of biomedical communications at UTM, so an expert in how our brains and our eyes attend to visually presented information. So comparing this and other common models of police use of force decision-making, she's helped us write a critique that's currently under review at Vision in order to, again, lend a visual neuroscience perspective to some of these contemporary issues in policing. And I'm kind of quickly zip through the next couple of slides. But just to exemplify how important it is to present information in a different way. And this is perhaps no more relevant than now with COVID, where they're showing numbers on the news every day and it's grabbing our attention and it's meant to drive a certain narrative. The same can be said for how police use of force statistics are displayed. So I'm going to show you two different ways. So looking at real data from a large Canadian police agency over 4 years, see the total number of police public interactions, total number of use of force reports filed by police, and how many specific use of force incidents that involved. So just looking at these numbers, they might seem staggering and overwhelming, but represented another way, we see that the actual reality is that the vast majority of police public interactions don't involve any use of force. But I do want to highlight that this incredible minority of use of force incidents do disproportionately affect people of color, minorities, and individuals with suffering from mental health problems. So I don't want to diminish that fact, but it is really important to understand that how information is presented impacts our learning, impacts how we process information. So in moving forward with contributing to police research, we do definitely want to move away from the more subjective self-report measures and rely more on objective indicators of stress and performance. And we're doing this by hosting a special journal issue calling for studies that look at police and other first responders and looking at objective biopsychosocial indicators of occupational stress injuries. And so through my applied research experience, I've also learned a whole ton. So the benefits of conducting police research is, often working in real world contexts, answering real world questions that have a large impact on society, but it can be very challenging as well if you don't have support from leadership, if you don't have buy-in from the officers that you're trying to engage, adapting experimental paradigms to the organizational operations and shift work, as well as maintaining privacy and security of your data that is very confidential and holds information about officers' mental health and performance, as well as highlighting one of the big limitations in the existing literature is controlling for pre-existing operational stress injuries, as well as subsequent traumatic exposures that officers are very frequently exposed to. And those two factors will definitely impact any conclusions made about the effectiveness of any sort of OSI program. So some of the research that we are doing right now, so funded by CIHR and CIPSERT. So CIHR recently funded $20 million to public safety training, and some of the folks that I highlight in that screen, including Judith, were awarded these team grants. So these involve experts from different disciplines to investigate. Judith specifically is going to investigate how we can deliver a version of IPrep, so autonomic modulation training, remotely and online, so perfectly in time for COVID, in order to reach officers across Canada that maybe they work at an agency that doesn't have the resources for fancy biofeedback equipment. We have funding to ship them a wearable heart rate monitor and download the HRV biofeedback app. And we're going to be developing online technology enhanced training in order to share these outcomes with officers across Canada. We're also going to be investigating sex and gender as determinants of health, so really focusing on the perspective of female officers, as well as developing effective coping strategies, not only for individuals, but also for their families, to build kind of an ecosystem of resilience. And that's something that's being headed by Greg Anderson out in BC. Other future directions include continuing use of neuroscientific investigation of police in situ, so in real world settings, looking at objective visual motor indicators like eye tracking, like we've been doing with our partners in Finland. And there was, I think, a CVR talk yesterday about virtual reality and motion capture. And this is another really hot topic area in policing, with increased investment in fancy schmancy virtual reality setups, but that might not actually be as effective as a more basic live setup. And I have some preliminary, not published data, but we show that when the same officers, 186 officers, are performing a video scenario, they have markedly more errors and actually no errors in the no-shoot condition. So they don't shoot anyone they're not supposed to in a live scenario, but see a relative increase in the number of errors made when it's virtual. So the implications of virtual versus live environments for officers being evaluated definitely have huge implications, and is a ripe area for investigation. We can also integrate wearable EEG to try to tap into the brains of police officers, as well as pre and post structural functional MRI to see how training influences activation, once again, in these motion object body parts of the brain that would definitely be influenced by, so affective realism is when stress causes you to see something like a gun when really the object is just something benign, like a cell phone. So getting answers to these questions and neuroscientific insights in police is really important and remains to be seen. So finally, I hope to show that this entire program of research is really intended to contribute to not only police reform, but social justice as well, through evidence-based recommendations for use of force training that's rooted in scientific principles. And through different activities, we also tried to disseminate this information as broadly as possible. So not only social policy reports, but in open access articles that will reach the practitioners that we're intending to really help through this research. And involving them in every stage of the research process through integrated knowledge translation, in order to be able to drive actionable change that is not only going to build safer communities, but also improve occupational health and safety for those that dedicate their lives to serving and protecting our communities. So with that, I want to thank all of the people that have helped me to get where I am today, starting with Joe and all of the fantastic people at York, Center for Vision Research, Neuroscience Grad Diploma Program, and all of the fantastic lab mates and coordinators, collaborators that helped put some of this scientific evidence together. Also need to acknowledge Dr. Judith Anderson at the University of Toronto, fantastic lab mates there, and our colleagues at Police University College of Finland, and specifically the principal, Rehtori Kimmo Himberi, who has been an unwavering supporter of our ongoing collaboration between the U of T and the PUC since, I think, 2014. And finally, recognizing Dr. Greg Anderson as a fantastic mentor and doing great work out in BC. And this is him on the first day of working with him. I went out to visit him in BC. He tried to take me on a hike and I didn't last very long, like a typical Torontonian. I said, let's get out of here and go to the pub. But he's great. And I thank all of you guys for your attention, and I welcome a great discussion.
Yay! Okay, or you can do another thing.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, so we have a number of questions here. I don't know if people want to unmute themselves first and ask them just live, or are we gonna have Paula read the questions?
I
don't know.
actually-
Rob, you had the first question, Rob, if you wanna.
I've hidden the chat. Like, I just wanted to focus on the
Oh,
slide.
no,
What
totally,
I'm
totally.
saying, so I don't even know where the chat is. Let's get
Oh.
on the chat.